So we're here today to talk about our AHRC-funded research project, What's on Rethinking Class in the Television Industry, which we've been working in partnership with Channel 4, the BBC and Candour Productions. So we're going to share some of what we found, what we've been thinking about, and there'll be time for some questions at the end. But first I want to start with where we are right now, because Class is having sort of a moment in the television industry. So yeah, if you look at what's been happening across the industry recently, the signs are hard to miss. So BAFTA published its Invisible Barriers resource to help creative leaders become more class aware. The Creative Diversity Network announced plans to add questions about socioeconomic background to the Diamond monitoring forms. James Graham, a couple of years ago, devoted his McTaggart Lecture at Edinburgh to TV drama's responsibility to represent class and region. And the TV Foundation, which is the charitable arm of the Edinburgh TV Festival, they launched a new impact unit specifically focused on class and social mobility. So at the moment, there's this real energy around the subject, right about the time that I guess maybe just a little bit after we started our research projects. So it feels like the industry is paying attention. But then at the same time, if you look at what's happening on screen too, working class stories are very visible at the moment. So if we think about shows like Elmer's Not Normal or Sherwood or Queenie, Brassic, Big Boys, all these shows, has been a real wave of programming that centres working class experience across drama, but also across comedy as well. But then when you look behind the camera, things are very, very different. As we've probably all heard by now, because this statistic is bandied around so much, but this research from the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre, published in 2024, found that only 8% of film, TV and radio workforce come from working class backgrounds. So at that moment where those working class stories are sort of more visible on screen in a way, and we're seeing that big wave that I talked about, actually the people making that kind of television are less likely than ever to come from those communities. And I think that audiences feel that gap as well. So Ofcom have done their own research with audiences from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and groups, and found that there's a real mismatch between what broadcasters say they're doing around diversity and around what those audiences actually experience. So working class audiences who watch nearly twice as much TV as middle class audiences have told Ofcom that BBC in particular and the BBC's representation of their lives felt completely out of touch. And, they specifically said, one person said that TV was being made by older, middle class, white, and often male creators. So there's a bit of a paradox here. Working class life on screen is there, but working class people are increasingly absent from the rooms where those decisions are being made. And that has consequences, not just for who gets to work in the industry, but for what gets made and how it lands with audiences. So that's the landscape that we're working in at the moment, sort of in the late 2010s, sort of early 2020s onwards. Working class stories are visible, but those structures that determine who get to tell those stories and on what terms remain largely unchanged. So the question we wanted to ask is, what's actually happening when class meets television production, not just who appears on screen, but who's in the room making decisions, how those decisions shape what gets commissioned, and how those decisions shape audiences' expectations and experiences of those shows. So that's kind of what our project sets out to investigate, and Beth's going to take you through how we're doing that and what we're doing specifically in the project.
Oh, thanks very much, Laura. So I suppose before we get to the findings, it's worth me just giving a really quick overview of what the research project is. Laura's just made some really brilliant points there, what we set out to do and why it matters. So what's on Researching Class in the UK television industry, as Laura said, is AHRC funded. It started in 2023 and runs through to this year, 2026. And we've got 4 members of the research team. I'm based at the University of Leeds. I'm Beth, and I'm the PI of the project. We've got co-I Laura here from the University of Salford. There's also Dave O'Brien from University of Manchester, and Anna Saborgi, a postdoc research fellow, also based here at Leeds. So for us, I think really that the core aim is to bring together questions that are often discussed separately in scholarship and in policy, and also often in the industry, namely who produces television drama, what gets made, and how class is represented and understood by audiences. So as Laura's sort of noted, in recent years, class has really re-emerged as quite a central issue in British television, from concerns about access and progression in the workforce to debates about how class lives are represented on screen and how audiences interpret those representations. From our perspective, part of the reason that we wanted to bring this project together is that we felt that there hadn't been a UK project that fully connected the 3 areas of production, representation, and reception in a sort of sustained and intersectional way, with that focus on class. So that's really what we set out to do. As Laura said, we're working in partnership with the BBC and Channel 4, and also Candour Productions. And the BBC and Channel 4 partnerships really give us embedded access across 2 contemporary drama series that form our case studies. Methodologically, the project is designed to work across like multiple levels. So it includes network ethnography to sort of map relationships and working practices within production, in-depth interviews with commissioners and producers, creatives and crew, textual and framing analysis of the programmes themselves, and audience research, which includes both sort of partner data and our own focus groups. So what that allows us to do really is trace, I think, class dynamics across the whole life of TV drama, from commissioning and the set to the narratives that reach audiences and the meanings that viewers take from them. And ultimately, the project helps us to understand class in television, not just as representation, but as something that operates structurally through labour and through culture and power, and in ways that intersect with gender, race, disability, and region. Okay, I'm going to pass back over to Laura. Thanks.
So I'm going to talk about 3 findings. We're not going to go through all of them just because there's so many, but just three that stuck out to us and that we think are useful sharing. So one of the things that emerged really strongly from our research is that generation matters, and it matters beyond ways that we would initially expect. So we're not talking about generational stereotypes like Gen Z versus boomers, but something more structural. So it's about what happens when a cohort of workers who were socialized into the television industry under fundamentally different conditions end up working alongside each other, often without recognizing how different those conditions really were. So if you entered the industry in the broadcast era, roughly the 1980s through to the 2000s, comparatively anyway, you would have experienced, I guess, relatively stable in-house employment. You'd have structured training schemes and maybe more predictable career ladders, not definitively, but by comparison. And television was organised more so around public service broadcasting, mass audiences, and a shared schedule. But if you're entering now in the platform era, the landscape is very different. Freelance precarity, short-term contracts, compressed schedules, and hiring that depends heavily on personal networks. And what we found is that those different formative experiences produce very different dispositions in the workers themselves, and different assumptions about what counts as skill, what commitment looks like, and how a career should work in the TV industry. So we see this dynamic really playing out across 3 interconnected mechanisms in our data. The first is what we describe as the erosion of shared cultural repertoires. So broadcast era workers were socialized into TV as a mass medium, something that organized everyday life. It gave you a common set of references you could share with colleagues. Platform era entrants have grown up with something quite different. So, personalized feeds, multi-platform engagement, more fragmented viewing, and it becomes particularly significant when this intersects with genre hierarchies, and because the industry has shifted towards high-end or premium drama, and that's what they want now. And the dramas that don't fit that mold have been pushed further down the hierarchy. So, for instance, continuing drama and soap have historically trained the most people and employed diverse workforces and served the broadest audiences, but they're increasingly treated as lesser forms. And we could see that come across in our interviews as well. And so the skills developed in continuing drama, sustaining characters over long arcs and producing at a very quick pace and building that audience intimacy are really vital. But then we found that soapy became a shorthand for not good enough, and those skills actually became liabilities on a CV, and that really disproportionately affected regional and working class entrants whose careers often begin in those forms. So as well as this, younger people compared to the older generation aren't starting out in soaps and aren't watching those soaps era. So there's a mismatch between those shared understandings of TV and what people watch and what they want from it. The second mechanism is hierarchy. So the structure of TV production is quite similar, I think, in terms of generations, but the terms of engagement have changed. So in the broadcast era, paying your dues was a sort of rite of passage within a fairly stable system. You endured it because progression was likely, that you had to do certain things, and work certain hours and go to different social events, for instance. But in the platform era, those same rituals happen in a freelance economy with no guarantee of what comes next. So what was once a temporary test of endurance, something that you think, okay, I just need to get through this and I'll get a full-time job. It's now kind of a class filter. If you have family wealth or connections, you can ride out those insecure early years. But if you don't, you're far more likely to leave before you ever progress. And these, dynamics often get misread as attitudinal as well. Older workers often see younger colleagues' reluctance to endure those exploitative conditions as a lack of dedication, whereas younger workers see older colleagues defending those conditions as out of touch. But neither are wrong, both are responding rationally to those industrial conditions over their formative years. One group was shaped by a system that rewarded endurance, but the other is navigating a market where the same endurance may lead nowhere unless you have that safety net of class privilege. And then finally, that third mechanism is a shift from institutional mentorship to networked gatekeeping. So broadcast era entrants often encountered sort of mentoring as built in as part of their working life. So they'd have long-term teams, in-house departments, someone who actively sponsored their progression over the years. And that sustained mentorship has become increasingly rare. Training schemes are contracted, teams are assembled and then disbanded production by production, and schedules are too compressed for the slow work that real mentoring requires. So what's replaced that is that informal recommendation, word of mouth, who you know, and that advantages people who have already arrived connected to the industry through family or class proximity. And one interviewer we spoke to talked about being on the brink of giving up, and they worked as a swimming coach to pay the rent while emailing EastEnders for years, just trying to get in the door. And that level of persistence isn't sustainable without financial backing. So those are the three sort of mechanisms, that erosion of shared repertoires, the hierarchy, the institutional network mentorship, moving to network gatekeeping. So on the surface, it does appear as a clash between older and younger, workers. But I think actually it's a misrecognition of structural change. And it's that misrecognition and lack of understanding that allows the problems to persist because it focuses on the individuals rather than on the conditions that shape them. So Beth's going to now take us into the financial realities that sit underneath all of this, the material costs that make these divides so consequential for working class entrants.
Thank you very much. So, so on this slide, I think it's where we really see how class inequality in television isn't only about who gets in, it's about who can afford to stay in long enough to progress. So across our production interviews, it became really clear to us that financial security is now a hidden requirement for working in television. Careers are structured around intermittent contracts, of course, long hours, early career roles that are poorly paid relative to the living costs close to production centres. One senior participant put it very bluntly, the only people that can afford to perform professionally and sit around and wait for jobs are people that usually have some money in the bank. And I think one of the things that quote captures is how the labour market increasingly selects for people with external financial support, savings, family help, or a partner's income, for example. So for working class origin workers, these conditions operate as a kind of structural survival test. Crucially, attrition doesn't always happen at the point of entry. It happens over time, even when people are talented and employable. So a pattern we heard repeatedly from working class origin participants was what we might call the near miss progression. So workers reached a point where they were consistently getting work, but still couldn't build stability because contracts were short and gaps were frequent. So many described, of course, taking on other paid work outside the industry in between productions, while peers with financial support could remain continuously available for the next job. And this is where money links directly to working culture, really, because being able to survive TV also depends on being able to say yes to a system built around long, inflexible hours. And that's captured really clearly in the second quotation here from a junior worker. If you've got kids and you're trying to break in, it would be nearly impossible. You're out of the house for like 14 hours a day. So what we see is that class inequality is reproduced not only through recruitment, but through retention and progression. So through who can afford to endure insecurity and overwork long enough to move up. And that's why we argue that entry-level diversity initiatives aren't enough on their own, because you can bring people into an industry that still isn't structurally set up for them to build stable careers. Okay, I'm going to pass back to Laura now.
So one of the things that compounds those pressures significantly is geography, because I think the industry likes to tell this story about regional production, and it's a story of progress. That production is moving out of London, investment is flowing into the nations and regions. New studios are opening and quotas are being met, and there is truth in that. Production activity has increased outside of London, but our research shows that production activity and creative authority are not the same thing. You can have crews working across the country while the commissioning decisions, that editorial influence, those senior creative roles all remain concentrated in London. So the work moves, but the power doesn't. So one senior creative we spoke to put it quite bluntly when talking about the move to Media City, the BBC's move to Media City. And they said when they did it, it was quite ironic for all of those who were working up there that we still weren't getting any work because they just brought everybody from London up there. So that's a pattern that we hear about. Productions relocate, but they bring their existing networks with them. So some local workers will get, the junior and mid-level roles, but the senior positions, the heads of department and the creative decision makers, those tend to travel with production from London. And that creates, a two-tier industry. You get the regional production without the regional power. So the work is there, but maybe the career infrastructure isn't, or at least it's much thinner anyway. Workers outside of London described longer gaps between contracts, fewer opportunities to build sustained relationships that lead to progression, and limited access to those people making those commissioning decisions. So, this connects directly to what Beth was saying about financial barriers, because the geographics I mentioned makes those barriers worse. And if you're working class, if you don't have those savings or family to fall back on, and you're also outside of London, you're managing precarity with fewer opportunities to offset it. And the alternative, relocating to London is itself a class barrier. It requires money and flexibility, and often you have to leave behind your family or your responsibilities. As one production manager told us, I think the ship has sailed for me to move away to London. I've got a family. I don't want to work away. So there's a real tension here between what the industry presents as progress and what workers actually experience. So regional production is genuinely important. It matters for a myriad of reasons, for workers, for representation, for commissioning. But unless commissioning influence and senior creative authority move with the production, you might end up just with dispersed labour, and that disproportionately affects people who are already the most precarious. So yeah, those are our three findings. Beth's going to now talk through about the film we've been developing with Candour Productions, which brings together some of these voices in a different form.
Oh, thanks, Laura. So yeah, so alongside the sort of written research, one of the key outputs has been a research-led film collaboration with Candour Productions. And Candour is a female-led multi-award-winning independent production company based in Leeds. And together we've produced one 16-minute short film and 4 minis of around 2.5 minutes each. That focus on a different theme emerging directly from the research. Now, those films are in the edit. They're nearly there, and they'll officially launch either at the very last week of this month or the first week of March. But that collaboration has been really important. Not only the collaboration with Candour, but with the group of industry professionals who brought their insight and experience and critical perspective to the project. So those collaborators include Hassan Khan, Claire Bennett, Danny Brocklehurst, Masana Ahmed, Caroline Moran, and Cameron Roach. And the films, all 5 of those films, are directed by Iman Labad. And across the films, I think we're trying to represent 4 findings. The first is really to do with class inequality. So class inequality in TV is about survivability, not, ultimately about talent. The second thing we're trying to really articulate through those films is informal recruitment is the sort of engine of exclusion. The third finding is something that Laura has already discussed. So the industry has changed, but its expectations haven't. And fourthly, that cultural codes quietly determine creative authority. So the films or the work of those films is really a dissemination tool and a way of making that research more legible, emotionally, narratively, professionally to the people who can act on it. While obviously the films aren't quite ready yet, we which we hope is okay, have a tiny rough cut of one of the mini shorts, the 2.5-minute shorts that we can share. And Laura's going to kindly put that on the screen now. So you will see the graphics here are not the final graphics. This is a rough cut of one of the minis, but it's something we can share.
The industry is still predominantly London-based. I definitely considered it, but you know, I was very aware that it was going to be expensive and difficult to just move to London without a job, so I didn't.
The industry loses out on some really talented people before they can get to that sort of top level because they don't necessarily want to stay in London.
I've never had a meeting with a production company that hasn't been in London, and those trains are expensive, extremely expensive. And if you are from a working class background and you don't have access to financial resources, is it sustainable as a career?
That nature of work and people's ability to cope with it is probably the biggest reason people leave the industry.
I think it's so different when you compare it to a lot of other careers, whether that's going into teaching or nursing or legal profession. There are some very obvious steps on that ladder, whereas TV, there are no rules and everyone has a completely different journey.
First of all, you're going to be like, I don't know how to get into the industry. Secondly, you probably haven't got the financial resources to move city or to take very low paid work or unpaid work. You know, there's lots of these barriers, there's lots of these things that might make you feel like, what am I doing here? You know, I think we've all sort of felt that from time to time.
I think it's an industry of massive risk and massive reward. It's been particularly difficult to go from job to job if you're a freelancer and sort of feel financially supported, because it might be a very low paid job and you might not necessarily know how long you might work in that low paid job without the guarantee of getting into that development role.
Being invited into those casting rooms was a massive deal to me, and I was so grateful to be there that I didn't want to like do anything to deter away from that. I didn't know whether I was going to be homeless in a couple of weeks, which was a whole different debacle. But that, again, that's just the life that comes with sometimes being working class. You know, a lot of these other people weren't having to go home and think about whether they're gonna actually have a roof over their head in the next week.
If the wealth in television was spread out more equitably, the problems wouldn't be as bad. What the industry can do to make it better is give people jobs, not short-term contracts, because you can't get a mortgage on the back of short-term contracts.
Oh, thanks so much for sharing that, Laura. So that was to really give people a bit of a sense of one of the mini shorts and a bit of a flavour of what the films are trying to articulate. As we said, it's a very rough cut, and the graphics will all be amended. But we, as we got access to that, we wanted to be able to share it at this point. So we'll move on to our almost final slide, which is the what's next slide. So I suppose really to close, we want to end with this question about what comes next, because for us, the project is not just about producing evidence, it's about trying to move from evidence to action and into forms of output that can actually travel across the industry. So what the research is suggesting very clearly is that class inequality in television is structural. It's not reducible to individual aspiration or confidence or resilience. It's built into the way that the labour market works. And one of our strongest findings is that entry is not enough. You can widen access at the point of recruitment, but if the industry remains structured really around long hours cultures, informal hiring, London-centred power, then what you get is churn rather than change. So what matters is progression, retention, and sustainable careers. The other key point is that regional productions need regional power. We've seen production dispersal, but we haven't seen equal dispersal of creative authority, decision making, or long-term, I suppose, career infrastructure. And finally, we argue strongly that class needs to sit alongside race, gender, disability, region in diversity frameworks, not as an add-on, but as a core dimension of how inequality is produced and reproduced in television work and culture. In terms of what's still to come, the first article to come out of the project was published on Monday. Maybe we'll bob that in the chat in a moment. We've got 5 more academic articles coming across the different strands of the project, and a book planned with Manchester University Press. We're also producing other outputs designed specifically to speak to industry and policy audiences. So in March and April, we'll be releasing a policy brief developed in partnership with the Film and TV Charity, which focuses on class inequality, workforce sustainability, and mental well-being. And the key point there is that we're explicitly framing class as a labour market issue, not simply as a diversity issue. And then in April, we'll publish our full industry report, which brings together the project's findings across production and representation and reception, and sets out a set of sort of practical recommendations that can be taken up by broadcasters, production companies, funders, and regulators. Alongside that, obviously, we've got the launch of these lovely films in the next few weeks, hopefully last week in Feb or first week in March. The next point for us is really about translation. It's about making sure that the evidence that we've gathered doesn't just sit within, I suppose, academic publication cycles alone, but becomes part of the conversation about how we build a television industry that's more sustainable, that's more inclusive, that's ultimately more credible, both as a workplace and as a cultural form. Okay, and I think we've just got thank you and any questions.
Well, thank you so much. That was fantastic, ladies. Thank you very much. Do people have questions that they would like to ask? I can dive in quickly if nobody's one. Well, people thinking about it. Here's mine. You're talking about, well, what do we do about it? Do you think there is a solution that doesn't involve some kind of rollback on the casualisation of the workforce, which has only been accelerating, frankly, since COVID even? Every time one discusses this, particularly in any kind of industry environment, it's always taken as read that this completely precarious casualised industry that we now have is the only option. There are not any other options. So we must start our discussions from that assumption. Mm-hmm. Do you think that if we start our discussions from that assumption, there actually is a way forward?
Oh, Krista, that's a brilliant and really and a really challenging question. I mean, I suppose from my perspective, the reality is that the discussions will absolutely start realistically from that assumption. But one of the I suppose, or one of the sort of really clear aspects that our evidence points to is that actually regional production and ecosystems are absolutely and utterly essential to the sustainability of the industry, and they are essential to mental health. They're essential to ensuring that we've got an industry that both operates and is inclusive and that audiences respond well to. So, for example, you know, the Waterloo Road recommissioning from 2022 and the production culture around that through Rope Ladder is one example of where we can see that working really well. It's you know, it's over multiple seasons, and what we know is sort of happening inside of there is not it's not a one-off contract, so people are able to develop. There's lots of new voices that come into a production like that, but there's also opportunities to move up, to develop, to sustain. So it would be, you know, a sort of vertically integrated culture where people can really see progression, and that sort of model has the by far, you know, significantly better results than you know the sort of freelance model. That's a half answer. I'm going to think about the other bit of the question.
Those long-term contracts or serial short-term contracts?
Yeah, I mean,
Or both?
I mean, ultimately, it's long-term contracts. I mean, on shows like, for example, like Waterloo Road, you know, often they will film 2 series back to back, so the contract is for 9 months, you know, and so that you know that tends to, you know, be long-term. It gives people, you know, real stability. But, you know, even if we're just, you know, picking, I suppose, you know, an obvious example, if we can look at Angela Griffin, who played the head, you know, in the first sort of series, and then is now, you know, directing, you know, various, you know, episodes and series as part of that show. So it really allows for progression, and obviously Angela Griffin is a very sort of experienced actor, but very much, you know, had a desire to work behind the camera and to influence production in those other ways. But there's lots of examples of that, and actually that model is really, really, really powerful, and it's not entirely reverting back to the nostalgia of, you know, the old days of Granada or ITV, but it's looking at new models which are actually having a really positive impact on both the people who work in it and on audiences who are watching it. I don't know if Laura wants to add anything. Sorry, Laura.
No, I think the honest difficulty is that many of those solutions require that government intervention and a fundamental shift basically in how companies and, you know, broadcasters and production companies operate and how they calculate value as well. You know, the many people we spoke to have just said that nothing else matters now other than high-end drama. Like, that is sort of the ultimate goal. So it's sort of changing those ways of thinking. You know, not just thinking this is the cheapest possible production, but thinking about it in different terms and how we go about doing that.
Questions, folks? Oh, Rowan. Hi.
Hello. How are you both? It's
Good,
lovely to
you.
listen to you. So I suppose this is building on, and thank you for the presentation. This is building on what Krista said. So when you spoke to your commissioners, how much did you challenge them on things like publicising commissioning schedules or making, you know, quoting them across the year? And how much possibility did you find in those conversations of a renewal of the PSB remit around with an increased in-house production as a way of kind of eroding the power of the production companies, who are, of course, the biggest source of short-term programming? And how much persuasive power do you think that you have generated against the model that PACT have imposed on the industry since the WOC and before? You know, so understanding all of these things are absolutely interconnected. What do you think has come out of the data that can be really persuasive on those big forces on the industry?
Oh, thanks, Rowan. That's it's a great question. I mean, I suppose I would start by saying that our interviews with the commissioners were not about challenging their practices. They were about trying to get the minutiae of their practices to be articulated through guarantees of anonymity. So they were about trying to get a better understanding of those practices. Obviously, some of the questions that we asked may well have pushed and pulled in some of the directions that you have mentioned, but in terms of the roles of commissioners within the cycle and the relationships between commissioners and indies, as you know, it's incredibly complicated. There are various and often very vocal and visible pushes toward recognising that diversity within UK PSB commissioning is absolutely and utterly essential for connecting to audiences, for, you know, representing new stories. But that does happen in very different ways. So some broadcasters and some channels, for example, may well have commissioning schemes, and it's quite interesting to be able to look behind those schemes and think, okay, well, actually, there are elements of diversity that are being focused on here, but perhaps this is not really an intersectional picture. And does class come into this? Now, from the conversations that we had as a research team with commissioners, class didn't come into that understanding at all of diversity. It was just not considered relevant in any of those remits particularly. And so I suppose that brings us to some of the bigger challenges in terms of what's included and what's excluded when we're thinking about diversity. And one of the real important things we wanted to ensure with the project is that it's intersectional. You know, we're centering class, but class absolutely interacts with these other elements of identity. And that was really, really important. If we just separate it out and put it on its own, that's not realistic. People don't live single identity lives. But did we find that recognised in commissioning? Not in terms of class. And while diversity is often a focus of changes in commissioners or updates to commissioning teams, there is an element in which what might be called new commissioners are in fact developers. So the person who's always commissioned continues to commission, but they have a larger team under them who are called commissioners and who come in under the banner of commissioners, but who aren't really commissioners. They are developers and have important different experience, not class different experience in terms of what we found, but other different experiences and other different characteristics. But do they get to make the decisions? No, is what we found. So I know that doesn't quite answer your question, but I think in terms of the project and our engagement with commissioners, there's still a lot of work to be done. And going back to what Laura mentioned earlier, I think some of that work has to come through policy. It will only happen through external measures rather than internal measures. And that's not because I don't think of bad faith, but it's a role in which the talk about change is not producing change. It's producing perhaps a veneer of change, but not a change in power. And it's the power that actually is important. So the power change will only come probably through policy. That's the only thing I can share, really. Sorry, Laura.
I was just going to say, in terms of your last question and what will commissioners care about, I think one of the things that they'll care about is how, from our focus groups, how audiences perceived those institutions. So working class viewers saw the BDC, for instance, as institutionally middle class without watching. They said, I don't even watch any BBC shows. I just know that they're middle class and they're stuffy and I don't want to watch it. And I think this will maybe ring some alarm bells. And if we're saying that this connects to both production sort of and representation, that then hopefully it will get sort of things moving sort of in the right direction, saying that they're all connected, and this is a big thing that they will not want. They won't want this to be a perception of themselves, basically.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. And when you were saying that, Laura, there was one other thing that occurred to me, which is while commissioners and even the very senior people within the indies that we spoke to didn't say necessarily a huge amount about those practices and processes, actually, as well as the 2 case studies. We also had supplementary interviews with other people in the industry who worked in TV drama, both PSB and actually beyond PSB as well. And one of the things that has come through the data quite clearly in relation to that, and some case study data, but in relation to that, has been that people, those colleagues have been very open about what they think the problems in relation to class are in relation to commissioning and production chains, and where and when they come up, and how, you know, how standard processes of pitching for all of the public service broadcasters are almost identikit in terms of the way in which expectations around behaviours, expectations around narrative hooks, expectations essentially around class are formulated, as well as other things which you'll definitely be aware of and have heard of. You know, oh, we've had our working class show for this year. We, you know, that slate's full, or we've had our women's show, or we've had our, our Scottish show. So, so that there's lots to work through there, but maybe not quite in the. We sort of came at it from a slightly different angle. That's where we found, I think, some of the most interesting findings or evidence.
Anybody want to chuck another one at Beth and Laura? Yeah. Oh, Darren. Cheers. Thanks, Darren. Go on.
Hello. I don't have a question. It's more of a comment. Myself and Micah, who's also in the meeting, involved a project on looking at post-industrial communities, and one of the ideas of it is to give those people voices, and the idea that very seldom their stories are talked about, their stories are told by others, but not by themselves. I think what your research is showing is some of the reasons behind that, of why, you know, working class communities often are portrayed in negative ways, stereotyped, caricatured, which is something they often feel themselves. So, you know, I'm just wishing you luck with having the impact on this, and yeah, trying to change things, because I think there is a real gap and so many barriers which you highlight for why, you know, people from those backgrounds, you know, may never ever, you know, be able to tell their stories in the way that they would like to. So great work. Thank you.
Oh, well, thanks very much, Darren. And just to say, one of the academic papers that's coming out, we don't know exactly when yet. It's currently under review, but is very, very much focused upon the issues that you're talking about, and also makes a really clear link between I suppose production conditions and representation. So, you know, and I think really brings something new to that space. So as soon as we get a decision, hopefully, fingers crossed, a positive decision back from the review, you know, we'll be working to get that pushed out as soon as possible. But yeah, one of the papers is absolutely and directly on that, and it's also to a lesser extent, but will be addressed in the industry report as well. So please feel free to stay in touch if you would like. Very welcome. But thank you for your interest, and it's great to know. I always think we're just putting bricks in a wall when we do research, and we're just trying to build things together, and it takes all sorts of different bricks, doesn't it, to do that.
Speaking of which, I mean, I don't know how much you looked at this, but I do remember listening to somebody at Equity a couple of years ago talking about how the profile of equity members, therefore basically actors, had become more and more up middle class over the last 5 to 10 years. After, that's where it started. Then it sort of, there was an opening up in the 70s onwards, I suppose. And now it's all retreated into a really, really specific, very specific space, which I think is interesting what you were saying about the, conditions of production, because of course, if you're going to do more working class dramas, you're going to be doing it with public school kids who can do a good Cockney accent.
It's, I mean, I remember that equity data. It must have been a couple of years ago.
It was.
Yeah, and I think I can't remember if Laura and I talked about it at the time, but I mean, unfortunately, it's so stark and so totally unsurprising, because ultimately from the evidence, it's very clear that actually, things are worse. The television is suffering a myriad of crises, and while there is value in those crises being downplayed a little bit, I suppose part of our role as researchers is to really understand those crises better and work out where they sort of interlink, and that ability to sustain now in an industry is incredibly difficult. So it's absolutely no surprise at all that in terms of equity members, in terms of working class entrants, there may now be more schemes related to entry and diversity perhaps than ever before, but actually people cannot sustain careers, and ultimately that we get this, as we've said, what that produces, even with even with goodwill, even if those schemes are brilliant, it produces churn. It doesn't, it doesn't produce sustainability. And so, even if people can get in, they can't stay in. And therefore, but stats tend to only be measured at the point of entry. And I think that's something that we're really keen to change. Progression is integral, and having good data around progression and having support, mentorship that works. And, and when Laura and I were talking about, the different eras and the intergenerational aspect, we were under absolutely no illusion that, that there wasn't significant inequality, in the, in what we're calling the broadcast era, particularly in terms of, race and gender. It was absolutely not, some sort of utopian time, and we're very aware of that. But the structures were much more stable, and they are, one of our interviewees said, they used to be, they were talking about, when they joined TV, and said, I get sent on all sorts of errands. I had to go out and get underwear for, my boss's partner for Valentine's Day and other grim things. But ultimately, I knew it was all leading somewhere. And the line that they used was, the ladder is now missing altogether. That they could see a ladder there. It was leading somewhere, and that ladder has essentially been obliterated. So yeah, Laura and I could talk about this. There's so much. We're really excited, to be able to articulate the evidence of this because we just think it's so important. There's lots, you know, we're at the point in the project where there's a lot to come out over the next 24 months really, and that's both you know frustrating in that, you know, obviously we'd love it to come out sooner and, you know, publishing cycles are what they are, but at the same because we want it to have an impact, is not just about getting it out, it's about how can that be put to work then to try and make change. I suppose particularly, you know, coming up to you know, which we know has already started, charter review, and, you know, the other various going to be very, very tricky times in television. So yeah, thank you.
Well, look, thank you so much. It would be great if there was time for more questions, but you know, we have to make these things short and sharp, and it's been really, really fascinating. Thank you so much, Beth and Laura, and we may well get you back to give us an update in a couple of years' time. Thank you, everybody, for attending. There is a recording. We will eventually be posting it. And just to give a little plug, we have something completely different in a month's time on eco-education and filmmaking, community filmmaking in South America, I think is what we have in this slot next month. So yeah, look forward to seeing some of you again then. And thanks again, ladies, for your presentation. Fabulous.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Krista.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.